Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we're diving into a topic that honestly completely rewired human history. We're talking about the deadliest pandemic on record, the Black Death. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this thing, we kind of need to turn down the lights a bit and step back in time. We can't just look at this as some dusty historical footnote. We need to feel the terrifying reality of what it was like for the people who actually lived through it. Let's get into it.
So, I want you to picture this. Imagine waking up in a bustling medieval European city. The year is 1347. Normally, right outside your window, you'd hear the chaotic sounds of merchants shouting, wooden carts rattling over cobblestones, animals, literally thousands of people going about their day. But instead, it's just silent. Why is your city completely silent? Imagine this invisible enemy just creeping slowly, almost ghost-like, from town to town, leaving these once thriving, vibrant communities entirely hushed. It's a chilling thought, right? Because the invisible enemy had arrived. This eerie, haunting silence that started taking over these medieval towns, it wasn't just some bizarre fluke. It was the terrifying beginning of the most devastating health crisis in human history. And here's the craziest part. The people living through this had absolutely zero advance warning. No push notifications on their phones, no modern news alerts, literally no way to know what was coming for them.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, Setting the Stage, 14th Century Europe.
To really grasp how this invisible enemy was able to conquer an entire continent so incredibly fast, we can't look at the 14th century through our modern lens. We have to look at the daily reality of the people who were about to be caught right in the crosshairs. It was basically a perfect storm brewing. Medieval cities were growing at a rapid pace, and trade routes were absolutely booming, connecting distant parts of the world like never before. But, with that economic boom came some pretty severe consequences. People were packed into super cramped living conditions, and sanitation, well, it was incredibly poor. Waste was quite literally just tossed out the window and into the streets. Without even knowing it, they had inadvertently created the absolute ideal, thriving environment for a rapid, deadly outbreak to just take hold.
Which brings us to Section 2, The Invisible Culprit, Unmasking the Threat.
Now, for the victims living back in the 14th century, the cause of all this suffering was a complete and total mystery. But today, thanks to modern science, we can finally point the finger at the true source of this devastation. Modern research points to a microscopic killer. We're talking about Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. Now, historians do continue to brilliantly study all the possible transmission routes and the different variations of how the plague spread, but the scientific consensus heavily points to this specific bacterium as the main vector. I mean, it's just astonishing to think that something totally microscopic could bring entire empires to their knees.
Let's move along and see how this actually builds. This microscopic killer relied on a terrifyingly simple biological chain of transmission. It's like a deadly relay race. Step 1, the bacterium infects a flea. Step 2, that flea hitches a ride on a black rat. Step 3, because of those cramped, dirty living conditions we talked about earlier, that rat easily enters human spaces, homes, storehouses, ships. And finally, step 4, the infected flea bites a human. It was just a brutal, highly efficient chain of infection. Moving right along to Section 3, the unstoppable march, east to west.
So, how exactly did this microscopic bacterium manage to take over the world? Basically, by hitchhiking. It traveled along the very networks that were actually meant to bring humanity together, our global trade routes. From an unknown past, it steadily traveled along the Silk Road, that massive trade network connecting the East and the West. By 1346, it had reached the vital Crimean port of Kaffa. And then came the critical leap. In 1347, it boarded merchant ships and crossed the Mediterranean Sea. The exact same trade routes that brought beautiful silk and spices were now literally transporting death.
And here we see the fateful consequence of that journey. Infected ships arrive in Sicily. This wasn't just a situation where a few sick sailors arrived in port. No. This was the exact moment the plague was unleashed upon a completely unsuspecting European population. The very moment those ships docked, and the rats scurried down the mooring lines onto the docks, the fate of millions was sealed.
Let's get into Section 4, The Reality of the Plague.
We've talked a lot about the bacterium itself and its journey, but what was the actual physical reality for the victims once this invisible enemy finally struck? Once a person was infected, the physical toll was deeply unsettling. It usually kicked off with a sudden, severe fever, which was quickly followed by just completely debilitating weakness.
But the most infamous and honestly the most agonizing symptoms were the swollen lymph nodes, commonly known as buboes. And the onset of this severe illness was incredibly rapid. A person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy one morning and be fighting for their life just a few days later.
Section 5. A continent in panic. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer psychological toll this took on people. I mean, you can only imagine it. As the death toll absolutely exploded across cities and towns, society was gripped by a level of fear, confusion, and widespread panic that we can barely comprehend today. People were desperately searching for answers, and it created this devastating disconnect between reality and belief. Look, today we know to look for bacterial infections, right? Fleas, rats. But the tragic reality of the 14th century mind is that they didn't know any of that. They blamed this horrific suffering on divine punishment, on dangerous astrological alignments, on deep-seated superstitions, and completely ineffective medieval medicine. They were essentially fighting a biological war using spiritual weapons.
And because of those beliefs, their desperate early responses were sadly entirely futile. Kings tried to isolate their royal courts, just locking themselves away behind castle walls. Churches held these massive gatherings to seek divine mercy, which, ironically, only helped spread the disease even faster in those crowded spaces. Physicians applied medieval treatments that honestly did way more harm than good. And ordinary people? Well, they either fled to the countryside, taking the disease right along with them, or they just succumbed to total panic. They had absolutely no effective means whatsoever to stop it. The terrifying reality was that the disease was spreading much, much faster than anyone could stop it. It was no longer just an isolated outbreak in a port city. It had mutated into an unstoppable, overwhelming force, just tearing across the entire European continent. It was outpacing their medicine, their prayers, and even their fastest horses. Which leaves us with this final chilling question. With absolutely zero known cures and zero understanding of the microscopic killer that was hunting them, how would humanity survive its darkest hour? Europe was standing right on the precipice of one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, an event that would alter the very fabric of society forever. We are going to explore exactly how the world endured this absolute nightmare and look at the astonishing aftermath in part 2 of this explainer. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you next time as we continue our journey. Welcome back. Let's dive right back into this explainer and pick up the story exactly where we left off. If you caught part 1, you know we were standing right on the precipice of a global catastrophe. The plague had just knocked on the door of medieval Europe, and honestly, the world was about to change forever. Today, we're going to explore the terrifying spread, the total collapse of societal norms, and the incredible, long-lasting aftermath of the deadliest pandemic in human history. Let's get started. Think back to that terrifying cliffhanger we ended on. I want you to imagine looking out at the horizon of your port city. You know that the trading ships coming into the harbor aren't just bringing silks and spices anymore, right? They're bringing an invisible, relentless antagonist. The plague had arrived, and literally nowhere was safe. There was just no running from this. The psychological toll of knowing a completely misunderstood killer was marching across the continent, it's almost impossible for us to fully grasp today. Section 1. The unstoppable spread. Let's look at the sheer, terrifying speed of this disease. The velocity of this contagion was just staggering. In year 1, the disease hitched a ride on merchant vessels, infiltrating bustling Mediterranean ports like Genoa and Venice. It was a maritime invasion. But by year 2, well, it wasn't just a coastal problem anymore. It utilized the very trade routes that built medieval wealth to sweep rapidly through inland cities, moving as fast as a horse could gallop. And by year 3, it had reached the harsh, freezing northernmost regions of Europe, places people thought were completely isolated. It crossed borders, bypassed armies, and overwhelmed communities in just a few short years. The sheer logistical speed of this pathogen, in an era way before airplanes or trains, is absolutely mind-blowing. Section 2. Society brought to a halt. Let's look at the immediate consequences for medieval civilization. Entire communities were crippled by a massive domino effect across every fundamental pillar of daily life. When trade networks froze, the food just stopped arriving. When farming was completely abandoned because workers were either too sick or too terrified to go into the fields, famine set in. Governments and local councils were entirely unable to function, mostly because magistrates and officials were dying at the exact same rate as everyone else. Daily life, religious services, local markets, the whole shebang, everything simply suspended. It was total institutional paralysis.
society literally brought to a grinding halt. So, a really crucial point here is how humanity tried to fight back in the dark. Some towns recognized that physical proximity equaled death. They pioneered early forms of public health. In fact, the word quarantine actually comes from the Venetian word quarantena, meaning 40 days, which is exactly how long officials in places like Venice forced arriving ships to sit at anchor before anyone could come ashore. It was brutal, but it worked. Conversely, we see tragic failures. Many people, out of sheer panic, bypassed travel restrictions, fleeing infected towns and carrying the disease right into the next village. Plus, archaic medical practices like bloodletting or relying on astrological charts offered absolutely zero protection and more often than not made patients significantly weaker. Section 3. The economic upheaval. Let's look at the massive shift in human civilization.
What's truly fascinating is how this massive tragedy inadvertently laid the groundwork for modern economics. It was a real domino effect. Step 1 was the tragic, staggering loss of life, which directly caused severe labor shortages across Europe. There simply weren't enough hands to till the earth or shear the sheep. Step 2, because labor was now incredibly rare, the surviving working-class peasants suddenly realized they had leverage. For the first time in history, they could actually demand higher wages and better living conditions. And step 3, this new dynamic caused the rigid, oppressive feudal system to fracture and steadily decline. The lords could no longer unconditionally control the serfs. So, in a very grim, paradoxical way, the surviving working class saw a massive increase in their standard of living.
Section 4. Fear, rumors, and scapegoating. We need to look at the human psychological response here. We really have to emphasize historical accuracy here. It was complete panic in the dark. Medieval Europeans had absolutely no concept of germ theory or microscopic bacteria. And, when you don't know what's killing your family, terror takes over, and human instinct desperately searches for someone to blame. This fear and a complete lack of medical knowledge drove people to spread vicious misinformation. Tragically, this led to the scapegoating and persecution of innocent minority groups and vulnerable communities all across Europe. It is a profoundly dark reminder of how fragile societal tolerance can be during a crisis when fear outpaces facts.
Section 5. The science of survival. Let's talk about the scientific turnaround of our story.
So, how did it actually end? Well, historians and scientists believe there wasn't just one magic cure, but rather a combination of multiple overlapping factors that finally led to the gradual reduction of the pandemic. First, those early, crude local isolation measures slowly improved and became way more widespread. Second, infectious diseases often have natural cyclical waves of burning through a highly susceptible population and then receding. And third, complex shifts in the ecology of the black rats and the fleas that carried the disease naturally altered the transmission chains over time. The fire basically just ran out of fuel.
Centuries later, modern medicine finally unmasked our invisible antagonist. Scientists identified a specific, rod-shaped bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. It's wild to think that this microscopic organism was the true architect of so much global devastation. By finally identifying the enemy under a microscope, science stripped away the supernatural terror that had haunted humanity for generations.
And I know exactly what you might be thinking. Is it still out there? Well, yes. While it sounds like ancient history, the plague still exists today in certain parts of the world, mostly residing in wild rodent populations. But thankfully, our modern understanding and the invention of antibiotics have completely transformed the landscape. It's now incredibly rare, and more importantly, it is highly treatable if diagnosed promptly. What was once an absolute terrifying death sentence is now just a manageable bacterial infection. Section 6. Echoes of the Plague. Let's look at the long-term aftermath and legacy. The science of history is never truly settled. Even today, historians and epidemiologists hotly debate the exact mortality rates. Some say 30% of Europe died, others say it was closer to 60%. They also still debate the specific mechanisms of how it spread so impossibly fast. Was it purely rat fleas, or did human-human transmission play a larger role in the colder months? While the broad strokes are known, these ongoing debates really highlight how deeply complex and fascinating the study of past pandemics truly is. Ultimately, the Black Death changed the course of history forever. It inadvertently forced the birth of organized, state-sponsored public health. It taught us the hard way the absolute necessity of scientific preparedness and trusting verifiable evidence over rumors. But most importantly, it showcases the incredible, undeniable resilience of human societies.
Civilizations were pushed to the absolute brink of collapse, yet they adapted, rebuilt, and eventually entered the Renaissance.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Knowing how a microscopic bacteria upended the entire medieval world, how do the lessons of the deadliest pandemic in history prepare us to face the unknown crises of tomorrow? It's a question definitely worth pondering about our own resilience and preparedness. If you found this explainer fascinating and want to keep unpacking human history with us, make sure to join us for our next explainer. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and keep learning.